then they can come on.
Gotcha. Good morning. Welcome to the Light on Suitability podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Comeau. I am with co-host Dean Laureles. Ooh, I see Michael. And Michael Gawlik, another co-host of mine. I want to just say I don't like to say this anymore because I don't want him to be labeled like this. But just so for context, Michael is my former client, successful candidate after a parole hearing, after 2 parole hearings. And now he's out in the community doing his thing. We've been really lucky to grab Michael. He set aside his time today to return to the podcast. He's been absent a little bit just because life has gotten pretty busy. And so that would be really fantastic that we have also PVSP is not hosting or co-hosting or doing anything other. Pleasant Valley State Prison is in Coalinga, California, and we've got an audience of eligible parolees, meaning they should be coming up for parole in the next year, 2, 3, whenever it is. And they're very interested in this podcast, and they're not able to. It's a podcast for the family members to sort of give them an education, but Dean pulled some strings and was able to get them to tune in because obviously the content is relevant to them. So I've been sharing it with family members in this fashion to maybe hopefully get to the, by telephone, what the things are saying. So what else? We will be shielding questions off the record, but this show, I was hoping Joe would be here. We are going through Joe Haytas's book, 36 Strategies of Suitability, with a fine-tooth comb, really. We're going chapter by chapter on on all of his strategies. We are on strategy 6 today. We've already gone through the first 5, which were so amazing. I always repeat them, but the first chapter is Think Free. And then there's other chapters. My, older brain doesn't remember them off by heart. Stop being angry, get out of the gangs. I think get out of the gangs now. Stop doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Get courage to change things. But strategy 6, because I'm going to fill in my co-hosts since they don't have a copy of the book in front of them, and Joe's not here to give us an overview. So strategy 6, self-discovery, why it matters at a parole hearing. And I'll tell you right off the bat, why does it matter? Because the Supreme Court in 2009 and 2010 scolded the board for not granting parole, basically denying parole over and over and over. And I think Michael might have been in those years as well. So he's very familiar with this, over and over and over, based on the life crime. So in Ray Lawrence, the California Supreme Court said, hey, wake up. The title that governs the statute has many more criteria than just the life crime. It has actually factors of suitability in it. So we need you to stop doing that. We need you to start granting parole, and you can only deny parole on the basis of the life crime if there's a nexus to current dangerousness. Chaputis followed along and said, because then it obviously something new came in the California Supreme Court, or the people went, what does all this mean now? You've got to start granting parole. Well, how do we establish all of that stuff? And the California Supreme Court is really the court who came in and said, your nexus, your thought, your current dangerousness analysis is going to be based on whether this person can, well, actually it's the board that has to overcome the presumption, because everybody comes to the board of parole hearings there's a presumption that you will be released at that parole hearing. Initial hearing, second hearing, 10th hearing, 17th hearing, it's a presumption. And in the law, there's always such a thing called it's rebuttable. And so that's what the Board of Parole Hearings is really doing. Your two commissioners at the board hearing, they're going through that. Why am I saying this? Because Joe's strategy 6 is self-discovery. Where does self-discovery come from? In Re Shaputis, the Title 15 factors, the code, the cases that came after Shaputis that interpreted all that. And what did Shaputis said? There's that little blurb at the introduction to all the list of the suitability factors and unsuitability factors that said the board can test your past mental state, and compare it to your present mental state. The board can come in and look at your past attitude and look at it present attitude. What is your mental state? Most of our clients, your mental state is based on antisocial personality disorder. And most of my clients get that diagnosis, if not the sort of the softer diagnosis, if there wasn't something happening before the age of 15, conduct disorder. Anyway, this is why a lot of my clients ask me, why do I have to talk about the bike that I stole when I was 5 years old? Why do I have to talk about that juvenile thing that got dismissed? I just was picked up and released. Why do I have to talk about the crime that I got a determinate sentence and I served the time and all? Because the Shaputis case and the In Re Lawrence case said, okay, board, stop denying parole just on the crime, but you're going to have to come to the board with self-discovery. So that's sort of the lawyerly, long-winded version of why we are where we're at today. So whenever my clients say, I don't want to talk about the past, it's in the past. But you've been given this gift and you were gifted this by the Supreme Court. And so give them what they want. How is the board going to assess whether you've changed if you can't figure out who you were then, who you are now, and who you are then? Has all kinds of things, everything. And my clients ask me, I have to tell them about, this 3-year-old, this candy I stole and this and that. Yeah, just they're trying to figure out where it all sort of started to go down a path of toward antisocial personality disorder. And when did you start to unravel from that antisocial personality disorder and start to figure it out? And that's where Joe's chapter is so important. What is Joe's, Joe always has a quote at the beginning of his chapter. I believe this one is, life is filled with unanswered questions, but it is the courage to seek those answers that continue to give meaning to life. And if you look at this chapter of self-discovery, that is what Shaputis is saying. They want a coherent account of the life crime. What does that mean? In normal language, take responsibility. Don't minimize, don't deny, don't blame, don't excuse. Have remorse. Where does that come from? Well, number one, it comes from the Title 15 factors. But number two, if you're remorseful, obviously you're not the same person that you were before. And also, I always harp on 12 steps. Why? Because almost every question at that Board of Parole hearings could be tied to one of those steps: remorse, step 8, step 9, and more. Okay. And then insight. The board said that the word, Shaputis is the one that came in and said insight. What's another word for insight? Self-discovery. Past understanding, past mental state, present mental state, understanding past attitude, present attitude. What's another word for all of this? How does Joe describe it? Self-discovery. So it's the backbone. It has become the backbone of meaningful rehabilitation. How do you show a lengthy period of positive rehabilitation? We also call it now offender change under the structured decision-making framework. So it's the backbone, because you can have all the vocations, you can have all the certificates, you can have all the classes, the GEDs, even the clean time. The clean time is important too, because it gives sort of a concrete thing about how you're internalizing, but they also want you to articulate your internalization of all the things that you've learned and be able to talk to the board in a manner in which doesn't sort of, they have this thing that's called impression management. They don't want that. They don't want scripted answers. They don't want memorized answers. They want internalization to show them that you are not the same person who came to prison. And Joe talks about digging deep. It does. It means digging deep. And Dean's here. He's got Lighthouse 9 Consulting. You're probably working with him, so you know what it means. You're digging. You have to dig deep. You have to start going back, and then you have to start connecting dots. And I often call it like a puzzle. So when we get a puzzle, we sort of have the box. We know what it's supposed to look like because you see guys getting paroled and you learn about it in groups and this and that, or gals. So then so how do we start building a puzzle? We just have to start somewhere. It's not perfect all the time, but we start filling in the border, and then we start organizing the pieces. And that's what you're doing. You're gathering for self-discovery. You're gathering all these pieces about your past, about your childhood, about certain crimes, about their prison life, the why, the gang. And then you start sort of formulating this why. It creates a pattern. It really does. But you can't go from A to Z. You can't go, oh, okay, Shaputa says I want insight or need insight. I'm going to go from A to Z. It won't happen like that. It has to be a very step by step process and an unraveling process. And sometimes it involves a grieving process for what was lost, for what wasn't given to you as a child, which should have been given to you. And Dean talks about this a lot too, adverse childhood events. I don't think that ACEs covers enough of the trauma we face as children. I just don't. I think parents are inherently dysfunctional, other than the 5%. And then I've got a ranch hand that sometimes helped me. He says, well, that 5% just hasn't admitted it yet. But anyway, so that's why we're doing all of this. And it's like Joe says in his book, it's not, you can't just say, I've changed. The board wants to know how, why, when, what was the process? Take us through your process. And how do they test that? Through a variety of questions. I send my clients sort of I think it's 5 or 6 pages of sample questions that you can go through, not in terms of trying to memorize answers, because every commissioner will ask the question in a different way. And if they get a sense that you're coming in there trying to memorize your way out of there, you will get hit with a lack of credibility, a impression management, and they're just not going to trust that it's internalized. They'll say it's superficial. And therefore, you can't act, another thing from Joe's chapter, you can't act with intelligence and purpose until you've confronted the uncomfortable truths about your past. And that's what we're doing. That's the why. And so that's why I led off with why do we have to say this? Look at my 10 years of clean stuff, my vocationals, my GED, and my transitional housing. I'm good to go. Unfortunately, no. You have to have this element of self-discovery. And so Joe's really this is just the tip of the iceberg. He's just introducing the concept here. I've expanded on it by giving you the rationale for why it's here and why we have to do it. And I do have some clients that struggle with this. I just want the past to be in the past. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. And Dean, he's studying to be a PhD, and he's way smarter than me, and he can also understand why it's so important to unpack all of that. And and again, like my husband sometimes says, and I'm going to turn it over to one of you, whichever one wants to go first, probably Dean, because the audience knows you. But whether you're preparing for a parole hearing, my husband often says, the stuff you talk about on your show really is applicable across the board. It could be applicable to anybody. So it's just trying to grow into a better version of yourself, and wake up in the morning with purpose, because then once you get to the point where you wake up with purpose and you've got all kinds of stuff going on, and you're willing to say, well, if it doesn't happen, okay, but it'll happen next time. I know Michael had that attitude going into this parole hearing. If it's not this time, it's okay. I've started this project. I've started this book. I've started this group that I'm helping these guys, and I would like to continue doing that. And, he didn't have to do that. So his humility helped him a lot. There's so much. This is so much to talk about. Self-discovery is not as straightforward. It's ripe. I love the topic. Love the topic. So, Dean, why don't you take it away from, I know you're chomping at the bit.
Yeah. Well, good morning, Michael. And so I was, I like the way that you described it. You define self-discovery with insight, and it's such simple term. It's insight. And I think the importance of the self-discovery is because if you address the issues that today, going to the board, let's say I'm violent, let's say I'm a drug addict and alcoholic, and I address those issues, but I never get to the root. All I'm doing is putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. So I can't address the root if I don't go to it. And a lot of times, yeah, it's uncomfortable. I don't like to look at certain things. I don't want to think about certain things, but this is part of the process. And you mentioned, connecting the dots. And I can see how that's important because you've got to know where the behaviors came from. We go back into childhood traumatic events, the causative factors, where things were created, what, our beliefs, our behaviors, and our feelings, where those came from, and how those connect the dots into character defects and into triggers, and then developing coping skills. But it's to understand self. It's really a process of humility, of being a student, of being open-minded, being willing to change your mind. And a question that I always like to ask the guys is that if you're wrong about something, would you want to know? And usually everybody says, right, yeah, of course. But really, when it's something you've believed all your life, and it's a societal belief, it's a familial belief, are you willing to change your mind and say, you know what, are you open-minded enough? And a lot of times we've got to do that with ourselves, and it's a process. Everybody goes down their own journey, their own path. It's a process for them. Some things can be complicated for a person, some things a little bit easier. But I agree with the Supreme Court's ruling because the crime never changes; it's static. So I mean, you can deny a person forever on that, but it's up for us to show them change. And a while back, I was at a seminar with the keynote speaker was Jennifer Schaefer. At the time, she was the executive director of the BPH, and she really emphasized the board looking at the change. Are we still the same people? I think that for a lot of people, we can continue behaviors that can lead us back to reoffending. But I think for most people, it's 20, 30 years later that you've been in prison, you're not the same person you were when you committed the crime. But the idea is to be able to articulate that, to show it, and you talked about clean time, 5-6 years of clean time. You got to have a foundation. You got to show them that you're living in the change, and I've seen guys who end up getting, maybe after 3 years to the board, they get a write-up. And what they're doing is they're showing that there's not change. You're still doing things your way. When you committed the offense, you did what you wanted to do. You ignored the laws, you ignored rules, you ignored everything. So if you're still all these years later getting write-ups because you're doing what you want, ignoring rules, ignoring laws, then what's changed? So and that's for the board to determine, and they're very good at it. They've been doing it a while. But yeah, I think that that's really important, the self-discovery and gaining the insight into self. And it starts with a decision. It starts with the decision to change, and the desire to change, to be somebody different. For myself, it was about wanting to be the person that God created me to be a genuine and authentic person, to put away all the things that I had learned in the world and to be who I was created to be. I mean, I'm still working on it. I haven't arrived. So it's a work in progress. Thank God I'm not who I used to be, and I'm further down that path, but it's still, every day a challenge, and just applying what I've learned, applying the change. So it takes time, but it definitely important.
Dean, I love that. I really love that you said be who God created you to be. It's
Mhm.
really the essence of everything, because obviously God didn't create us to be, dysfunctional and living in our character defects. And that's the whole point of steps 4, 5, 6, and 7, is given all that over,
Right.
because it's, recognizing that you're an addict can be easy, can be difficult, but identifying character defects, and for those of us who can identify them but don't like to let them go too much,
Yeah.
step 6 can be can be trickier than even step 4, but it's so important. It's so important, and all the things you said can be accomplished
Mhm.
through a genuine, heartfelt participation in the 12-step journey. I want to call it, because it's not a I got the certificate, and Michael's an awesome one to talk to you about this as well, because he is someone who lives the steps and uses the steps a lot. So Michael,
Mhm.
I want to hear from you about Joe's chapter of self-discovery. I don't think you were here last year when Joe and I did this chapter. I can't remember where you came on board, but give
Yeah.
us your take and anything else you want to share.
Well, let's start with connecting the dots. All right. Um, I know when I was a kid, they had the coloring books with the connect the dots, and you'd follow the number from dot to
Can I
dot to dot.
interrupt? Can I
Yeah.
interrupt you, Michael? I think it would be so cool if they heard your background, because they kind of already know Dean,
All
and
right.
I'd love for them to have just a little
Sure.
snapshot, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So my name is Michael Gawlik. I served a I was serving a sentence of 40 to life for second degree murder with a firearm. And so for me, my gambling wasn't, or my addiction wasn't alcohol, it wasn't drugs, it was gambling. And my secondary addiction, which was really bad, was anger. I lived off of anger and gambling. And at one point, I lost more money than I could pay. I couldn't manipulate or intimidate my way out of the situation. And I started getting really triggered on that anger response. And instead of, handling it like a mature adult, I chose to go with my reptile brain and act out and lash out in violence. And with that, I murdered the card room manager that I was dealing with. And, it took me a lot of years to take responsibility for that. Even through about the first 8 or 9 years, I blamed him. I placed myself in the role of the victim. And it took a lot of work to get to where I am now. And, um, one thing that I saw a lot were, and it was mentioned here, a lot of people would go out there in the day room and study and study and study 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, all their self-help stuff and looking through their files and all this stuff for their court transcripts on their statements and all that stuff. And then they're surprised when they get that 3 or 5 year denial. And, they come back and it's like, well, I did everything you did. What did I do different? And I'm like, well, did you go in there and, have a conversation? Well, no, they asked me questions and, I would tell them what the book said. Well, when we live our lives just quoting the book, and I think Joe said it in one of our previous podcasts, you can train a monkey to quote anything. So, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at an automated response. They're looking at something that's not genuine and sincere. And, in my experience with the board, going in there, sitting down and having a genuine conversation is key. They don't want to hear all the 12-step rhetoric and all the celebrate recovery rhetoric and, this therapist said this. No. When they ask you, what is the most important step to you? They don't want you to sit there and just quote the step to them. They want to hear how you apply it to your life on a daily basis. Or when they talk about your anger management techniques, they know all the acronyms. They've been through all this dozens and maybe hundreds of times, depending on the commissioner. They know all this. Yeah, it's okay to say, yeah, I use this Q-tip method, it's quit taking it personal, but here's how I do it. This is what it, how it applies to me. It's not, well, Q-tip is this, this, and this, and it was developed by, no, they don't want all that. They know that. So for me, it was going in, and I had to set aside actually really studying all this stuff because I found it wasn't working for me. And the big change that I found that actually worked for me was starting to live these principles, applying them in my everyday life. And at that point, once I had done it for so long, it wasn't something I had to go sit down and study. And that's when we get to insight. Nobody knows us better than us. Nobody knows what was going through our brain in that moment. And, they have a kind of a decent idea based off of the psych eval and the court records and all that stuff. But they want to see what you understand, what you know. And they're looking for that enlightenment, that, that one piece that connects us all together. And they're not looking for some, stuff out of a, psychology book or a self-help book or whatever. They want to see that we've gone through and we've done the work, because like Elizabeth calls it, the shadow work. If we don't do the shadow work, if we don't do the self-examination and face the hard, cold truths of who we were in the past and about who we were when we committed our crime, it's like that puzzle book I was mentioning when we started. The old connect the dots, you had followed from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Well, if you didn't trust the process and follow the process, you got a distorted picture. And it's the same thing when we're going through the process of learning who we are. We have to find what connects us with the truth and with, who we were then and the responsibility that we had in our actions. Because, I know I was notorious for this, blaming other people for my decisions. And that's one of the big dots we have to connect, is how did I get to that distorted belief? This is why I blamed these other people, because I learned this behavior through this, and then I made the choice to continue with that behavior instead of getting help. They want to understand how we got from point A to point B to point C. And they never will until we understand it. And, self-help groups are a great tool to get there. The psychologists are a great tool to get there. But that's all they are, is tools. All that truth lies right here and right here. So when it comes down to it, we have to make the decision, just like we did when we committed our crimes. We made decisions. Well, it's time to make the decision to explore the hardest parts of our life, the hardest parts of our personality, the things that we're the most ashamed of, because that's where our answers really lie, is when we face our shame and our guilt and start digging in. How did I get here? What caused me to feel this shame? What caused me to feel this guilt? What caused me to develop these behaviors? And why did I choose to run with them instead of seeking help? Why did I choose to pick up that gun and pull the trigger? Why did I choose to lead a life of crime? Why did I choose to lead a life of addiction? And, I do agree that addiction is an illness, but it's an illness that we can manage with the right tools. But it comes down just to like everything else in life. It is a choice. Everything we do is a choice. So do you want to choose to face your past choose to connect the dots, choose to make the changes in life that are necessary, and choose to paint an accurate, truthful picture of who we were and how we got to where we are today. What is it you really want? If getting out of prison and being reunited with your family and your community and having that freedom is what we really want, we have to do the work, because, there's an old saying, you can't bullshit a bullshitter. Well, the board's pretty up on all the bullshit. So just go in there honest, have a conversation, and do the work. That's my best recommendation.
Michael, I'm starting to wonder if you've been reading my curriculum. Some of the stuff you're just spot on, man. It's when you talk about internalizing, and I always talk with the guys and tell them that it's like remorse. You ask somebody what's remorse to you, and a lot of times guys give you the company line. It's that deep sorrow regret you have when you've done something wrong. That's not it. I mean, granted, that's it, but that's not it. Apply it to you in your situation. What is remorse to you? Show me how you, when you first felt remorse, how you show that you're remorseful. What is it to you in your situation? It's really important that people be able to apply whatever it is, whatever insight they're gaining, but explain it. The boards, that's what the purpose of the board, it's about you. It's to understand you a little better. And like you said, and it's something that I always say, nobody knows you better than you. It's just, these questions are not difficult. They require some time to sit back and to go over them, to internalize, to learn about self, but they're not difficult questions. That's good stuff. I like that.
It's such a great, it's really just the beginning of a series of strategies that are coming in this book. And because it's kind of like Joe's think free. Well, okay, once you, and I think Michael mentioned it today as well. What do you want? What do you want? Because, and that's why Joe led that strategy with strategy 2. Okay, well, if you really want that freedom, then you can't do the same thing and expect a different result, which means you can't keep burying your past. Unfortunately, you have to bring it up. And sometimes for some of us, slow is better. Slow is better because it can be quite traumatizing, re-traumatizing as well. And so it's a process. I heard you guys talking about it's a process. It is a process. Once you make that decision, take it easy on yourself, because you're going to be peeling back some layers that you stuffed. We all did it. We stuff. And that's why we act all out here. Everything's out there. Like for Michael, it's a blame thing. And we all do. We can all do it as well. It's just whatever's external to ourselves. And so that layering, we have to come back within. Michael said it again, the truth lies within. But what we all do in life is just bury those truths. And sometimes we think for good, but that won't cut it for the board. So you really have to learn about who you are very well and on a very deep level, so that when you go to the board, you're just sitting down as if you're talking to a best friend, really, or a pastor, or somebody that you really trust, a sponsor. Can I plug the 12 steps again? Get a sponsor, get an accountability partner in addition to a sponsor. A sponsor sometimes is a great accountability partner, but really great insights. Michael's insights are always so great. Dean's are always said so eloquently. I love that a lot. Strategy. Go for it.
Yeah, I get a question from Michael. You went to the board more than once. What was the reasoning for the denials? What changed for you to go from not suitable to suitable?
Well, there were two major factors there. One is I went to board the first time in 2022.
Mhm.
2 years before, in 2020, I had a gambling relapse. And one of the questions they asked me when was the last time you gambled? Because gambling is a nexus to my crime.
Mhm.
And I told them, I had a relapse back in 2020. I was sitting in the day room on a COVID lockdown board, and somebody gave me a football pool ticket. I chose to take it and play it. A little later, I felt guilty about it. I gave the ticket back and went to talk to my accountability partner. But the fact is, I made that choice to take that ticket, fill it out, turn it in, and go through the process of participating in gambling. I chose to do that.
Mhm.
And that was my relapse. And we'll get back to that in a minute. The other one was there was some issues with a riot that I was in that I minimized my culpability. And, I really, that's one of the things that a lot of people have a hard time with is, oh, there's a riot. I really had no choice. I either participate in the riot or I get my ass beat during the riot, or afterwards, the fellows are going to come after me because I didn't have their back. So I really didn't have a choice. And, I kind of approached it that way initially. And with that, it was minimization because in the end, it came down to a choice. I could choose to participate in the violence in the riot. I could choose to not participate and face the consequences, or I could have chosen to not participate and go and say, hey, I do have fear for my life because I didn't participate in the riot. So there's choices I could have made outside of choosing violence. I chose violence. And at the time I went to board the first time, I went with the party line. It's like, I had no choice, this, that, and the other. And, this is why. And so, blatant minimization.
Mhm.
And, I knew it as I was saying it. But, again, there was still that seed of that little bit of criminal thinking holding on, saying, you know what, I'm justified in this. And really, I wasn't.
Right.
It all came down to my choice. And once I accepted that, and, it's funny, they didn't even ask me about it in the second hearing. But I had done some work with PrEP doing their confronting criminal thinking and denial management and things like that. And, um, you know, with the stuff that I wrote for that, I think the board was really happy with the way I approached that and handled that. As far as the
Mhm.
gambling, back to that. So it was that honesty about the gambling relapse in the first hearing that did it was a contributing factor as to why I was denied. But a year and a half later, when I went back to board, it was also one of the major contributing factors that earned my freedom, is because I went in there that first time and I was transparent about it. And in the first hearing, um, the commissioner's like, I don't know why you even admitted that, because we had no way of knowing. But like I told him, I am trying to be a better person. I'm trying to be more transparent with my life. And part of my recovery and my rehabilitation is being honest. So that's why I did it. It was like, well, we appreciate that, but at this point, we find that you're not suitable, that you still pose a threat. But in the second hearing, it was amazing when he brought that up, saying, your transparency and honesty back when it put you in a bad light and you had the potential of losing this chance to go home, which you did, says a lot about your character and a lot about your
Oh,
growth. So those were the two main things that, really um, earned me the denial the first time. And there were some little, small details that we discussed that we addressed and readdressed in some of the groups I did afterwards. But the biggest parts were the minimization and insight into the riot in my gambling relapse.
right. Okay. Yeah, I imagine that bolstered your credibility with them on that second hearing.
Yeah.
That's good stuff.
And it's also important, just as a general, as a broad overview, like, Michael, you could have chosen not to say anything. You would have been denied parole anyway, probably because of the riot minimization, and then you were missing some other things. But the reason I think it was so important is that, if you had not said something they didn't know, you got granted, there's that part of you, that part of your psyche that then is, maybe Dean can explain this, but it's kind of like our subconscious mind is saying, oh, it wasn't that bad, right? And that's just creating that slippery slope of of trouble. And I'm not sure how that works from a psychological point of view, but I know it's very human nature to do that. It's like, for me, and I don't make any bones about it. Alcoholism, you know, I could go down that dark road very quickly for myself by saying, even just entertaining the glamour of it, even if I'm just thinking about it. But it really, I don't know why, because our brain, it's like the power of what is it, the law of attraction or something. It's like we feed our subconscious brain, and then our subconscious moves for some reason, and then we start to do these little things, right? And I don't know what it is. And we're not always, when we're addicts, we're not always as in control of that part, that slippery slope. I think that Dean sort of is nodding, and I'm trying to explain it in a way, but there's just something about humans that
Yeah.
you just give an inch and we're going to take a mile, And so that could have been Michael's downfall later. Help
Right.
me out, Dean, if
Well,
it's
it's because you think you can, so you're minimizing. I can just do it this once. So, he plays one ticket. Okay, not a big deal. He gets away with it, doesn't say anything at the board hearing. And then it leads to something bigger, something more. Now, next, before long, he's running the pools. You know what I mean? So these things, they escalate. And it's because you want more, you want more, you want more. And an addict always thinks that they can get away with it. I can manage this, and that's that old saying. What is it? One is never enough, and 100, or what was it? I can't remember. It's an AA saying
one
about
is
a
too
100.
many, 10 is not enough.
Yeah, yeah. So it's and as far as the subconscious, it's just we think we tend to give ourselves more credit and think that we're stronger than we really are. And it's always going to happen to somebody else, not us, because we're special. So it's always going to happen to somebody else. But that's where we falter, and it's that overconfidence, is thinking I can get away with something. And again, it goes back to, it starts with something small. Now, what Michael, when he fessed up to it, so he nipped it in the bud. He talked about it, told him that what he did.
Step
It
5,
could
I
have
mean,
led.
that's the whole point of step 10. I'm sorry, step 10. And then it's step 10, you tell someone and make amends. And that was Michael's way of making amends. And I think he's stronger today on parole because he did the right thing, even though it wasn't rewarded at that time. But I
Yeah,
really do think it paid off in the bigger picture of things. And I'm not
yeah,
sure that people would disagree with me on that.
yeah. I agree with you on that, because I think that it's what we learn inside, and I think it was Michael who mentioned earlier, as applying what we learned, the practical application. So it's no good to sit there and just listen to it and not apply it, because it's pointless. So apply it. And so what he's learned inside, what we've learned inside, is these coping skills, these ways of being, because it's who we desire to be. So he wanted to be honest. He wanted to, to be able to own his crap, and that is helping him out here, and probably sometimes not even realizing it, because you get into a habit of doing stuff, and it is so easy. There's so many distractions out here that it's very easy to say, well, I can do this just once and get away with it. And the next thing you know, I knew a guy who was, he was one of those guys, I forget what it's called, but that does the urinalysis testing. Wasn't allowed to use alcohol, and he got away with it once. And so he thought, I can start doing it. And, I know when the PO comes over, I'll just drink at this time and won't drink at that time. And I'll flush until he got caught doing dirty. So it's like he kept thinking he was going to get away with it. So this one-time thing led to doing it more and more often until he was eventually caught. And that's usually what happens. The way we stop is being caught. But it's like with Michael, he nipped that in the bud so that even out here, there's things that he does. And if it's me, there's things that I don't want to go back to. There's things that I don't want to go back to doing. I don't even want to step in that direction because I already know. So that's, it just makes it easier. It's a coping skill, and it helps strengthen me to be able to live a more healthier lifestyle.
Yeah, and just in general, it's just a process of self-discovery. Is step one, it's honesty. It is. And step 4, courage. And step 8 and 9, one of those is make amends. So, or restitution. Speaking of restitution, again, you thought you could get away with it, not anymore. So next week, like I was saying, we're building on this, and Joe's going to start sort of taking self-discovery as a big umbrella concept, and now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. And so we're going to start with character defects. Again, where do the character defects, questions come from? The 12 steps. So that's really because alcohol, drugs, gambling, that's all just what we use to cope. And that's from step 1. But why is it we're using those to cope? Because we're layered with all these character defects that we haven't surrendered because we love them, because they're an addiction in and of themselves. So I think if everyone's satisfied with, anybody got any burning desires more on the chapter of self-discovery? If not, we will wrap up the podcast. I will end the stream for the public, and then we'll stay behind. I'm thinking that Dean said we're going to stay behind and answer questions, which means that prison can probably go on view, because I'll be ending the stream. So I will see Dean next week, I'm pretty sure. And hopefully, Michael, see you again. It's always great to see you. And I love having you on the show because you're insightful. You're successful on parole. You're living your life from a very authentic point of, in an authentic way, a very humble way at the moment. And it's always great to have that, just to see you anyway. It helps me too, to keep me motivated to do the work I do, for sure.
Well, and yeah, you say I did all the hard work, but you helped me through some difficult spots. And, I think without Gertrude's guidance in the first one and yours in the second one, I would have still had a few really rough patches that I had to work out. But you really helped make the process a lot easier. So thank you for that.
Yeah. But you're just taking the ball and running with it, which is awesome. And it's just great to have that for the audience. So I'm going to end the stream and see you all next week. Michael, are you sticking around, Michael, for the question and answer session? Can you? Or if not, we'll cut you loose. Got to unmute. I'm going to end the stream anyway. I'm going to ask you that question in a minute. Can you?